You can't just leave this here. This is a violation, and you'll be fined immediately." Victoria Haldane's voice cut through the humid summer air, sharp and smug, as she slapped the orange notice onto the windshield. My wife was still in the passenger seat, gripping her stomach, breath shallow, sweat running down her temples. She was in labor. I froze, staring at the paper like it was a bad joke. A fine? For pulling into our own driveway because we hadn't stopped to close the gate behind us? Victoria's heels clicked against the pavement as she turned, her arms folded like she'd just scored a win. "You're not even supposed to park here overnight. It's in the bylaws." She smirked. I let the words hang for a beat, then said quietly, "You really don't want to play this game with me." Her laugh was clipped, dismissive. "Excuse me? That security system you depend on to issue violations?" I wrote the firmware. My eyes locked on hers. Every ping, every log, every camera, it still reports back to my server. Her face faltered just for a second. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I'm Daniel Mercer, software engineer, the son of the man who planted that oak tree your committee suddenly hates so much. And I don't back down." Her smirk cracked, but she tried to recover. "The tree's roots are a hazard. The rules are clear. The rules don't mean anything when they're twisted for power." I kept my voice calm, steady, unshaken. My father had planted that oak 30 years ago, before the gates, before the HOA, before Victoria's reign of fear. He'd died just 5 years later, and that tree had grown into a monument, not just bark and branches, but memory. When my sister Claire and I were kids, we'd sit under its shade while Mom read to us. After Dad's funeral, I carved his initials into the trunk. Now the board wanted it gone, calling it non-compliant landscaping. That tree was my father's voice still standing in the soil. And Victoria had no idea she was trying to erase a legacy I'd never let go of. Behind me, I heard my wife's strained breathing, the car door creak as she shifted. I rushed to her side, squeezing her hand. Her knuckles were white, pain tearing through her body, yet Victoria was still standing there, clipboard ready, acting like a tyrant writing tickets at a funeral. I clenched my jaw, tasting iron. "My wife's in labor, Victoria. She doesn't need this, and trust me, neither do you." She sniffed, pretending to scan the driveway, then scribbled something on her clipboard. "Rules don't bend for excuses." I slid the paper from the windshield, crushed it in my fist, and stared at her until she looked away. Something in her posture flickered. Control, slipping just a little. Neighbors. Peeked from blinds and porches, watching the scene play out. Some whispered, most kept their heads down. That's how Victoria stayed in power, fear and silence, not with me. I leaned against the hood, steadying my wife with one hand. My voice dropped to a near whisper, but I knew she heard me. "You've chosen the wrong family to screw with." "Where are you watching from?" That night, as the hospital monitors beeped and my wife finally rested, I sat in the quiet and replayed the moment in my head. Victoria thought this was about a parking fine. She thought she could bully us into submission with her orange slips and bylaw threats, but I knew better. I'd spent years designing systems that tracked every action, every movement, every data point. And I had the truth sitting on my servers. Logs, timestamps, footage that would tell a very different story. Victoria had fired the first shot. She didn't know the storm she'd just unleashed. By the time we brought my wife home from the hospital, exhaustion hung over everything. She was safe. The baby was safe. But the orange violation slip still burned in my pocket. I couldn't forget the look on Victoria's face. That mix of smug confidence and thinly veiled contempt. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. The neighborhood felt different now. Driving past the trimmed hedges and polished mailboxes of Rosewood Estates, I noticed details I'd ignored before. Warning signs taped to doors, extra locks on side gates, and neighbors who hurried inside when they saw me. Fear lived here, hidden in plain sight. When we pulled into the driveway, another notice was already pinned to the front door. "Second warning, non-compliant landscaping." The words screamed back at me, all caps and underlined. They weren't wasting time. I peeled it off, fingers trembling, and read the fine print. Removal deadline, 10 days. Penalty per day, 250. And at the bottom, in neat black letters, was Victoria's signature. I felt my wife's hand on my arm, gentle but firm. Don't let them get to you, Daniel. Focus on the baby. I kissed her forehead, but inside I was seething. This wasn't just about us. It was about everyone in the community who lived under this petty dictatorship. I'd heard whispers before, about retirees fined for hanging wind chimes, parents penalized for chalk drawings on sidewalks, a veteran cited for flying a flag without board approval. One or two stories felt like rumors. Now I saw the pattern. That evening, I walked the neighborhood with our newborn strapped to my chest, just to breathe fresh air. On Elm Court, I stopped in front of a yard where a small wooden playset leaned against the fence, tagged with a violation slip like a scarlet letter. The owner, an older man named Henry, sat on the porch steps, staring at the notice. His face was tight, eyes weary. They said it doesn't match community standards, he muttered when he saw me looking. My grandkids play on that thing every weekend. I tried appealing, they added late fees instead. He rubbed his temples. Feels like they want to break people, not help them. I stood there a moment, the baby shifting softly against my chest. You're not wrong, I said. He gave me a hollow chuckle. You'll learn quick. Best advice? Keep your head down. But that wasn't me. Keeping my head down had never been in my blood. My father built systems to protect cities from blackouts. I designed security networks that corporations still depended on, and that oak tree, the one they wanted gone, was more than wood and leaves. It was proof that my family had roots here long before the HOA came with its bylaws and fines. The baby whimpered, and I adjusted the strap. The sound brought me back to focus. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. My daughter deserved to grow up in a place where fear didn't run the streets. When I turned the corner back toward my house, I noticed the blinds twitch at the unit across from mine. A neighbor, someone I didn't know well, stood there watching. Their face was half-shadowed, unreadable. For a second, I thought they might wave. Instead, they closed the blinds quickly, like they didn't want to be seen. Something about that glance stayed with me. People weren't just suffering quietly. Some of them knew things. And maybe, just maybe, one of them was waiting for someone to push back. By the time the sun dipped low and the crickets started their chorus, I was back at my desk, booting up my home server. The system logs glowed across the monitor, rows of timestamps, device IDs, access points. Buried in the noise, I saw the pattern. The HOA's cameras had pinged at the exact time Victoria wrote my first citation, proof that she hadn't just happened to be nearby. She was tracking us, waiting. I leaned back, heart pounding, and whispered to myself, "You're sloppy, Victoria." The oak tree rustled outside the window, branches moving with the evening breeze. It felt like my father was reminding me why this mattered. This wasn't paranoia. It was a system of control, and now I had the first thread. All I had to do was pull. 2 days later, I got the letter. Certified mail, HOA seal on the corner, thick enough to feel heavy before I even opened it. I didn't need to read it to know what it said, but I did anyway. Final notice, tree removal required. Failure to comply will result in daily fines and legal action. Legal action. That was their endgame. They wanted to drag me into court, drain me until I gave up. But what they didn't realize was that I knew the system better than most of their attorneys ever would. My career had been built on analyzing patterns, spotting vulnerabilities in networks and contracts alike. And right now, I could see their moves coming before they made them. Still, I needed more than instinct. I needed someone on the inside. The chance came sooner than I expected. That evening, I went to the community gym, not because I cared about lifting weights, but because I needed to clear my head. The place was almost empty, just the hum of treadmills and faint pop music overhead. And then I saw him, Marcus Boyd, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, HOA security liaison. He wasn't on the board, but he worked closely with them. More importantly, I remembered his face from the hospital footage. He was there the night Victoria issued that fine while my wife was in labor. Marcus avoided eye contact when I walked in, focusing hard on the punching bag. His fists hit fast and sharp, but there was tension in every movement. Too much tension. I sat on the bench, lacing my sneakers, and watched him for a moment. Sweat poured down his face. His jaw tightened. He swung until his arms shook, then stopped suddenly, gripping the bag like it might collapse. His chest heaved, breaths ragged. That wasn't the body language of someone comfortable with his role. That was someone breaking under pressure. When he finally glanced my way, our eyes met for a second. His flickered with something, guilt, fear, maybe both. He grabbed his towel, wiped his face, and muttered, "Evening," before heading toward the locker room. I didn't stop him, not yet, but I filed it away. Marcus wasn't as loyal to Victoria as he pretended. Something was eating at him, and sooner or later, it would spill out. On the walk home, I passed by another neighbor's house where a notice was taped to the door. Unapproved exterior light fixture. A young couple stood outside, staring at it like it was a death sentence. The woman's eyes were glassy, the man's shoulders slumped. They didn't even notice me walk past. This wasn't just my fight. Victoria and her board were waging a quiet war on everyone. But Marcus. Marcus was the weak link, and I wasn't going to ignore it. Back at home, the baby stirred, and I took her into my arms, rocking her gently by the window. The oak tree's branches framed the night sky, leaves whispering in the wind. That tree had seen everything, my father's laughter, his final days, and now the first weeks of my daughter's life. I whispered to her, "They think they can erase him. They don't know me yet." Inside, anger and determination braided together. Victoria might have power, but power built on fear always cracks. Marcus's fists against that punching bag told me one thing. The crack had already begun. I didn't need to rush. I just needed to keep pushing until the fault lines split wide open. 3 mornings later, the escalation hit like a hammer. I opened the mailbox to find a thick envelope stamped with "Urgent." Inside wasn't just another fine. It was a formal notice of lien. They were threatening to attach thousands of dollars in penalties to my property if I didn't comply with a tree removal order within 5 days. 5 days. The kitchen felt colder as I spread the papers across the table. My wife held the baby against her chest, silent but pale. "Daniel, they can't do this, right?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her it was just bluster, but I'd seen it before. HOAs leaning on homeowners until the legal fees piled up higher than the cost of surrender. That's how they won, by making people believe they were powerless, not me. Still, fear crept at the edges. A lien wasn't just a threat, it was leverage. It could ruin our credit, block us from refinancing, even cloud the title to our home. And Victoria knew it. That's why she pushed this card so quickly. She thought fear would be enough to crush me. I stuffed the papers back in the envelope, grabbed my jacket, and headed straight to the HOA office. The building sat near the entrance of Rosewood Estates, a sterile single-story box with tinted windows and a stone sign that read, "Community Resource Center." Inside, the air reeked of disinfectant, and the front desk was lined with pamphlets about neighborhood harmony and protecting property values. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria wasn't there, but another board member, a wiry man named Leonard, sat behind the counter. His tie was crooked, and he spoke without looking up from his screen. "Can I help you?" I slapped the envelope down in front of him. "A lien? While my wife's still recovering from childbirth?" He blinked, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed as if I were an inconvenience. "You've had multiple warnings. Non-compliant landscaping is a violation. This is standard procedure. Standard procedure doesn't usually skip straight to a lien." He shifted in his seat. "The board voted unanimously. You'll need to take it up at the next meeting if you want a contest." The next meeting. That was weeks away. They knew that? I leaned closer. "Let me be clear. You're threatening my family's home over a tree that predates this HOA. Do you understand how absurd that is?" His jaw tightened. "Sir, I suggest you lower your tone. These actions are authorized." Authorized! That word clanged in my head. Authorized by whom? Authorized how? I picked up the envelope and turned to leave, but not before catching sight of the bulletin board near the door. Tacked to it were the minutes from the last board meeting. I scanned them quickly. Routine approvals, budget allocations, landscaping notes. But something stood out. The vote on accelerated enforcement actions had only 4 signatures, out of 7 board members. 4 wasn't a quorum. I walked out with my pulse racing. They were pushing liens without proper authority. That was more than a mistake. That was a crack in the foundation of their entire operation. Outside, the sun glared against the pavement, heat radiating through my shoes. I stopped in the parking lot, gripping the envelope so hard it crumpled. They thought they had me trapped. But the system I'd built my career on, understanding the rules of networks where the pressure points lived and how to turn them back, was already at work in my head. The oak tree's shadow stretched across my driveway when I got home, branches swaying as if reminding me, hold the line. I whispered, I will. Victoria had escalated the fight, but in her arrogance, she'd also left her fingerprints on a flaw big enough to bring the whole machine down. The next morning, I didn't head to work. Instead, I drove across town to the county records office, a squat brick building tucked between the courthouse and a row of faded law firms. If Victoria wanted to throw legal action at me, then I was going to start at the root, authority. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and toner. Rows of filing cabinets stretched along the walls, but most of the records had been digitized years ago. A clerk with tired eyes pointed me toward a terminal. HOA records are under property associations, alphabetical. Good luck, she said, like she'd seen this before. I typed in Rosewood Estates. Dozens of entries popped up, bylaws, amendments, incorporations, renewals. My fingers flew across the keyboard, scanning each one. That's when I found it, the incorporation charter. According to the document, Rosewood Estates HOA had been established in 1991 with a 7-member board requirement and strict quorum rules for enforcement decisions. But buried deeper, in a scanned renewal from 2009, I saw something odd. The renewal had expired in 2019. No subsequent filing existed. 10 years, and no one had renewed it. That meant the HOA was technically operating without a valid corporate charter. Their ability to levy fines, file liens, or take legal action, potentially void. My pulse quickened as I leaned back in the chair. Years of designing system audits had trained me to catch gaps like this, small oversights that unraveled entire structures. Victoria and her board had been operating like tyrants, but legally, they might be standing on air. I printed the documents, my hands shaking slightly as the machine spat out each page. This wasn't just a lifeline for me. It was a weapon that could free everyone they had bullied. On my way out, I noticed a woman waiting near the counter, flipping nervously through a stack of violation notices. She looked up as I passed, her expression tight with frustration. "They're bleeding us dry," she muttered to no one in particular. I almost stopped to say something, to tell her what I'd just found. But I held back. Timing mattered. If I revealed my hand too early, Victoria would scramble to cover the flaw. No, I needed to prepare, build my case, and strike when the whole community was watching. Back at home, I spread the papers across my desk. My wife came in, baby in her arms, her voice soft. "You found something, didn't you?" I nodded. "They're not legitimate, not fully. Their charter expired years ago. They've been bluffing with no foundation." She let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. "So they can't touch us?" "They can try, and they will. But now, we have the upper hand." Outside, the oak tree swayed, leaves whispering against the glass. I thought of my father again, how he'd always said systems only work when people question them. "Never trust a wall," he'd tell me. "Find the cracks." I'd found the crack. But cracks don't bring down walls on their own. You need pressure, leverage, and the right moment. And that meant building alliances, drawing Marcus closer, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation at the board meeting. I tucked the papers into a locked drawer and closed it with finality. The discovery had shifted everything. Victoria thought she had me cornered. She had no idea she was standing on quicksand. The illusion of control never lasts long. By the end of the week, Victoria proved she wasn't slowing down. A bright yellow notice appeared on our front door, stamped with oversized red letters. "Final warning, lion pending." I stared at the paper, jaw tightening. They weren't waiting for due process. They were threatening to secure a lien against my home, the same house my father had left me, the same roof where my wife now rocked our newborn to sleep. If the HOA's bluff worked, they could jeopardize everything. When my wife saw the notice, her shoulders tensed. "They can't take our home, can they?" she whispered, almost afraid of the answer. "Not legally, not with what I've found." I took her hand. But they're betting on fear. They want us to fold before the truth comes out. That night, I sat at my desk long after the house was quiet. The stack of incorporation records lay neatly in front of me, but I needed more than paperwork. I needed allies. A single voice could be dismissed. A chorus could not. The first call I made was to Marcus. He hesitated before answering, his voice low. If this is about Victoria, you should know. I don't agree with everything she does, but speaking out, it doesn't end well. Marcus, I said evenly, the HOA's charter expired 6 years ago. They've been operating illegally. Every fine, every lien, every threat, it's baseless. Silence. Then a shaky laugh. I knew something was off. She pushes through decisions with 4 votes when the bylaws require 7. But expired? If that's true, it is. I have the paperwork. He exhaled slowly. Then you need to bring this up at the next meeting. But understand, if you do, Victoria won't just come after you. She'll come after anyone standing near you. That was the moment the stakes crystallized. It wasn't just about my family anymore. If I stayed quiet, neighbors like the woman I'd seen at the records office would keep living under threats. If I acted, we could all be free. 2 days later, I attended a neighborhood gathering at the park near the retention pond, a spot shaded by willows, and often used for community picnics. Only this wasn't a picnic. A cluster of residents stood in tight circles, holding violation letters and shaking their heads. Word had spread about Victoria's latest wave of fines. I stepped forward, nerves tight but resolve solid. They've been bluffing, I said firmly. Their corporate charter expired in 2019. They don't have the authority to enforce half of what they've been threatening us with. Dozens of eyes turned to me. A ripple of disbelief passed through the group. Are you serious? One man asked, holding up his letter. They threatened to lien my house over paint color. I have the documents, I said. I'll share copies with anyone who wants them. But you need to understand, if we push back, we have to do it together. At the next meeting, we hold them accountable. The conflicted expressions began to harden into something else. Resolve. Neighbors who had been silent now spoke up. Stories poured out. Threats, petty violations, intimidation. Marcus arrived late, lingering on the edge of the crowd. He didn't speak, but when our eyes met, he gave the smallest nod. He was in, even if quietly. By the time I left the park, a plan had taken shape. I would present the expired charter at the board meeting. The neighbors would back me. Marcus, as a board member himself, would corroborate procedural abuses. That night, I stood again beneath the oak tree in my yard, the moonlight filtering through its branches. My father's words echoed, "Find the cracks." I had found them. Now it was time to pry them open. This wasn't about one family being targeted anymore. It was about an entire neighborhood reclaiming its voice, and I was ready to see it through, no matter what it cost. The evening of the board meeting arrived with the kind of tension that vibrates beneath the skin. The community center's multi-purpose room, usually reserved for yoga classes and birthday parties, had been rearranged into a makeshift chamber of authority. Folding chairs lined the floor in tight rows, every one of them filled. Neighbors clutched violation letters, some holding photos of their infractions. The murmur of frustration hung in the air like static. At the front, Victoria sat at a folding table draped with a navy cloth, the HOA's seal taped crookedly in the center. To her right were 3 other board members. To her left sat Marcus, his posture rigid, his eyes flicking constantly between the crowd and the papers in front of him. His lips pressed tight, as though he were swallowing words he couldn't say aloud. When Victoria tapped the microphone, the chatter dulled. Her smile was smooth, rehearsed, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. We are here to maintain order and uphold the standards of our community. I remind you all that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. I sat in the second row, the incorporation documents folded neatly in a file on my lap. My wife couldn't be there. She was home with the baby, but her voice was in my head. Don't let them scare you into silence. The first 20 minutes dragged with Victoria, parading through petty violations, trash cans left out, grass exceeding 3 inches, unauthorized wreaths. The crowd shifted restlessly, grumbles rising with each pronouncement. Finally, she called for new business. My moment. I stood, holding the file. I have an item of new business, I said clearly, my voice carried, steady but unflinching. This concerns the very authority of this board to issue fines and liens. Victoria's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. You may speak, she said, the words clipped. I walked to the front, opened the file, and placed a stack of copies on the edge of the table. These are certified documents from the state registrar. They show that the articles of incorporation for this HOA expired in 2019. Since then, this association has not been legally registered as a nonprofit corporation, which means... I paused, letting the silence settle. You've been operating without authority. Every fine, every lien, every threat issued since then is legally void. A ripple tore through the audience. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering fiercely. Victoria's expression faltered for the first time all evening. That is a gross misinterpretation, she snapped. The expiration does not negate our authority. The bylaws remain enforceable. No, I countered evenly. The bylaws are only enforceable under a valid corporate charter. Without it, you're just a group of neighbors with no standing to impose financial penalties. Courts have ruled on this exact issue. Gasps and low cheers erupted from the back rows. I turned to the crowd. Every one of you who has been fined, every lien threat you've received, it's baseless, and I'll provide you copies of these documents to prove it. Victoria slammed her hand against the table. Order! This meeting will not devolve into hysteria. At that moment, all eyes shifted to Marcus. He hadn't spoken, but his silence was deafening. He sat frozen, papers untouched before him, his jaw tight. Sweat gathered at his temple. When Victoria barked, "Tell them, Marcus," his shoulders twitched as though struck. But he didn't speak. His hands fidgeted beneath the table, fingers clenching and unclenching. His eyes darted toward me for a fraction of a second before dropping back down. He was trapped, board loyalty on one side, conscience on the other. That flicker of hesitation was all the crowd needed to see. Voices rose. "He's right!" someone shouted. "You've been scamming us!" Another neighbor waved a violation letter in the air. "I paid hundreds for this. Where's my refund?" The room fractured into chaos, neighbors demanding answers, board members shrinking in their chairs. Victoria's voice strained over the noise, but the tide had turned. I stood still amid the storm, calm in the eye of it. My father's words rang in my ears. Find the cracks, press until they break. And tonight, one crack had already begun to split wide open. The meeting ended in disarray. Victoria slammed the microphone off, her voice drowned by neighbors demanding refunds and answers. Board members scattered like leaves in a storm, ducking questions and avoiding eye contact. Marcus lingered a moment longer, his face pale, before disappearing through the side exit without a word. I left the community center with my file clutched tight, adrenaline still humming in my veins. Outside, the night air was cool, sharp with the smell of cut grass. Clusters of neighbors gathered under streetlights, voices low but charged. When I passed, a few reached out, claps on the shoulder, whispered thanks. Their anger wasn't just about me anymore. It was about years of control and fear finally snapping. But Victoria wasn't finished. The next morning, I woke to a notice taped across my front door. Bold red letters. Immediate enforcement action. According to the paper, my property was in serious violation for a supposedly unsafe tree endangering community safety, the oak my father planted. They gave me 72 hours to remove it or face escalated penalties. My stomach turned cold. She was aiming straight at the symbol she knew mattered most. I carried the paper inside and laid it on the kitchen counter. My wife, cradling the baby, read it with a tight jaw. "She's retaliating," she said softly. "She's desperate," I corrected, though my voice betrayed the knot in my chest. "She's trying to scare us before the others rally." Still, fear pricked sharp behind my ribs. That tree wasn't just wood and leaves. It was the last living piece of my father on this earth. Losing it would be like losing him all over again. I took a breath and steadied myself. If she wanted to turn the tree into a weapon, then it would become my shield. That day, I pulled every record I could find, the city's public works portal, county tree preservation ordinances, my property deed, scanned and bookmarked, hours blurred together at the dining table, babies' cries in the background as I mapped every angle of protection. By late afternoon, I had the key. An ordinance that declared heritage oaks, trees over a certain trunk diameter native to the region, protected by city law. Removal required permits, inspections, and city approval, none of which Victoria could override. She hadn't just overreached, she had stepped squarely into a legal trap. I printed copies, highlighted passages, and filed them neatly with the incorporation documents. The binder grew thicker, heavier, each page another brick in the wall I was building. That evening, I walked out to the oak, its branches arched wide, leaves catching the glow of the setting sun. I ran my hand over the rough bark, hearing my father's voice again. Things built to last take patience, roots deeper than rules. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. "You've got them. Don't stop now." No signature. But I knew who it was. Marcus. His silence at the meeting had spoken volumes, but this was the first crack of loyalty breaking. He wasn't ready to stand in the light, but he was pushing from the shadows. I typed back only 2 words: not stopping. The next morning, Victoria escalated further. A letter slipped into neighbors' mailboxes accused me of slandering the HOA and spreading false legal claims. It threatened collective consequences, raised dues, suspended amenities, if malicious behavior continued. But this time, her tactic backfired. Neighbors knocked on my door one by one, waving letters, fury burning in their voices. "She can't do this. We didn't sign up for this. What's our move?" I invited them inside, spreading the documents across the table. Their eyes widened as I walked them through the expired incorporation and the city ordinance. Each page wasn't just proof, it was ammunition. "This isn't just about me," I told them. "It's about all of us. If she can take down the oak, she can take anything from anyone. But she doesn't have the power she thinks she does. We do." The room buzzed with energy, neighbors leaning closer, shoulders squared. For the first time, their fear was shifting into resolve. Victoria thought isolating me would break my will, but all she'd done was light a fire that was starting to spread through every home on this street. By the next week, the tide had turned. What began as whispered complaints over fences had grown into something louder, stronger, unstoppable. Neighbors were no longer avoiding each other's eyes on morning walks. They were gathering in driveways, huddled in kitchens, whispering plans and possibilities. I spent every evening at the dining table, papers spread out like a battle map. My wife kept the baby close, pacing gently while I worked. The binder of evidence had doubled in size. Each document felt like a brick, and together they were forming the foundation of something unshakable. The expired incorporation papers were our spear. The Heritage Oak Ordinance was our shield. But neither alone would topple Victoria. For that, we needed something stronger, a vote. Marcus confirmed it quietly in another late-night text. Bylaws say the board can be recalled with 51% of homeowners. That was our key. Not lawsuits, not endless back-and-forth letters. A simple, clean majority vote that would strip Victoria of her title and dismantle her power. We just needed the numbers. I started canvassing, door to door, clipboard in hand, binder under my arm. At first, people hesitated. Some cracked doors open just wide enough to whisper, "She'll come after us if we sign." Others listened with arms crossed, eyes darting to the street, fear etched deep. But I showed them the papers, the highlighted lines, the dates, the signatures. I laid out the trap Victoria had walked into, how she had no legal ground to stand on. One by one, fear gave way to something else. Anger, then resolve. Pens scratched against paper, signatures forming. Claire joined me on the second night. She had my father's fire in her eyes as she stood on porches, her voice steady and unyielding. "My dad planted that oak," she told them. "If they cut it down, what's next? Your garden? Your porch swing? Your kids' bikes in the driveway?" Her words landed harder than mine. By the third evening, neighbors were approaching us instead of the other way around. They came with their own stories. Unfair fines, petty threats, rules bent to break spirits. Each story added fuel to the blaze we were stoking. We didn't stop there. I used my tech background to set up a simple website, password protected, hosted outside HOA control, where homeowners could track our progress. Every signature counted, every voice tallied. Updates appeared in real time, a digital scoreboard of rebellion. Watching the numbers climb was like watching dominoes fall. Marcus's role grew quietly in the background. He slipped me internal communications, proof that Victoria was panicking. Draft emails riddled with desperation, threats of lawsuits that had no legal standing, frantic attempts to rally the remaining board members. They were fracturing from within. By the end of the week, we had signatures from nearly half the neighborhood. The momentum was undeniable, but we couldn't stop short. Victoria would fight until the last breath of her authority. I gathered a small group in my living room, neighbors I trusted, the ones who had stepped forward earliest. We spread the paperwork across the coffee table, the oak visible through the window behind us. Its branches stretched wide in the night, casting shadows across the walls like it was standing guard. "This isn't just about removing her," I said. "It's about replacing this entire system with something better, transparent, accountable. If we win, the slate is ours to rewrite." Heads nodded, shoulders squared. For the first time, I saw hope carving lines where fear once lived. We drafted the recall petition that night, citing the expired incorporation and the abuse of authority. Every word was measured, airtight. We stapled copies, filed them neatly, and stacked them high. Tomorrow, they'd go out to every doorstep in the neighborhood. I looked once more at the oak outside. Its leaves rustled in the breeze, whispering in the dark. My father's legacy wasn't just safe, it was becoming the rallying point for an entire community. Victoria wanted to make an example out of me. Instead, she had created a movement. The night before the petition drop, I barely slept. My binder sat on the desk beside me like a silent sentinel, its edges worn from weeks of battles. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victoria's face twisted in rage, barking threats, clinging to power that was slipping through her fingers. Morning came sharp and cool. The neighborhood looked the same, lawns manicured, cars glinting in driveways. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Doors opened earlier, neighbors lingered longer at mailboxes, glances traded with quiet recognition. We weren't individuals anymore. We were a force. I walked to the oak tree first. Its branches stretched into the sky, leaves flickering with sunlight. I pressed my palm to its trunk, grounding myself. Tomorrow, this won't just be about survival, I thought. It'll be about taking back what's ours. By mid-morning, we began distributing the petitions. Claire and I took one side of the neighborhood. 2 other volunteers handled the opposite. I watched as pens scratched across the pages, signatures landing with finality. Each name added was a brick in the wall of resistance. Some neighbors signed without hesitation, others after a few careful questions, but almost no one refused. By evening, the tally was undeniable. We had crossed the majority threshold. The numbers weren't just enough. They were overwhelming. Victoria couldn't stop this wave, no matter how she tried. Still, we had to be ready for her countermove. That night, a small group gathered again in my living room. Marcus slipped in through the side door, his shoulders tense. His eyes darted around before settling on the stack of petitions in the center of the table. "She knows what's coming," he said quietly. "She's planning to call an emergency board meeting to declare your petitions invalid, claims you don't have authority to circulate them." A murmur rippled through the group, but I stayed calm. "She's bluffing. The bylaws are clear. Any homeowner can initiate a recall with majority support, and with the incorporation expired, she's not on solid ground to begin with." Marcus nodded, though unease flickered across his face. "Still, she'll try to drag this out, confuse people, buy time." "Then we make sure confusion isn't an option," I replied. We went over everything again, the signatures, the legal citations, the ordinance protections for the oak, the expired incorporation. Every page was double-checked, every copy backed up. I had digital scans uploaded to a secure server, hard drives stashed in 3 different places, and multiple neighbors holding physical duplicates. Victoria couldn't shred her way out of this one. Claire leaned forward, her eyes bright with fire. "We don't just hand this in quietly. We make it public. We bring it to the next HOA meeting in front of everyone. No backroom games, no closed doors. Let the whole neighborhood see it happen." The room hummed with agreement. This wouldn't be a shadow war anymore. It would be a confrontation out in the open, where fear couldn't hide. I looked around at the faces gathered in my living room, people who had once been too afraid to meet my eyes. Now they sat upright, steady, ready. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were allies. The plan crystallized. Tomorrow we'd deliver notice of the recall petition to the HOA, forcing the confrontation into the open. Then, at the scheduled board meeting, we'd present the evidence in front of the entire community. No way for Victoria to twist the story. No way for her to claim ignorance. As the meeting wrapped, Marcus lingered. He pulled me aside near the doorway, voice low. "She's going to come after me once she figures out I've been feeding you information." I met his eyes, steady. "Then stand with us when it counts. Once this is over, there won't be anything she can do to you." For a long moment he hesitated, then he nodded. "Tomorrow?" When the last of them left, I returned to the oak tree once more. The night was still, the air heavy with expectation. I traced the grooves in the bark, remembering the day my father planted it. "Roots deeper than rules," he'd said. Victoria thought she was fighting one man. Tomorrow, she'd learn she was fighting an entire neighborhood. The community hall was packed. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as neighbors crowded in, more than I'd ever seen at a meeting. The low hum of voices buzzed with anticipation, a storm waiting to break. At the front, Victoria sat stiff behind the table, gavel clutched in her hand like a weapon. Her expression was carved from stone, but the twitch at her jaw betrayed her nerves. I walked in with Claire at my side, the binder pressed to my chest. Marcus trailed a few paces behind, pale but resolute. Conversations dipped into silence as people turned toward us. Dozens of eyes followed me down the aisle. The oak tree wasn't just my symbol anymore. It was ours, and everyone in this room knew it. Victoria slammed the gavel. "This meeting will come to order. We will begin with—" I stepped forward and set the binder on the table with a solid thud. The sound echoed through the hall, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Before any agenda," I said, my voice steady, "the homeowners of this community have business to bring before the board." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You're out of line, Daniel. This is an official—" "No," I interrupted, sliding a thick stack of papers across the table. "What's out of line is a board operating under expired incorporation documents. What's out of line is an HOA president issuing threats without legal authority. And what's out of line is targeting my family tree with fabricated violations when the law protects it." The stack of petitions landed squarely in front of her, page after page of signatures bound with clips, the weight of a neighborhood in ink. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of pages as a board member picked one up, eyes widening as he scanned the names. "This," I continued, projecting my voice across the hall, "is a recall petition signed by a majority of homeowners. Effective immediately, the board is dissolved pending re-election. You no longer hold power here, Victoria." Gasps erupted, followed by shouts of agreement. Neighbors stood, raising their hands, their voices rising. "That's right! We've had enough! It's over!" Victoria's face flushed crimson. She slammed the gavel again, her voice sharp. "This is invalid. These signatures mean nothing without board certification." Marcus stood then, his voice carrying over the din. "They mean everything. I'm the treasurer, and I've seen the bylaws. A majority recall requires no board approval. The people here are the authority now." All eyes snapped to him. For weeks he'd played the quiet loyalist, the man in Victoria's corner. Now he stood tall, his shoulders squared. The weight of his choice was visible, but so was the relief. "You traitor," Victoria hissed, but her words were drowned by the rising tide of voices. I opened the binder, flipping it toward the crowd. Highlighted lines from the city ordinance glowed under the fluorescent lights. "This oak tree is protected by law. They threaten me with removal notices, but here's the proof. No one, no board, no president, has the right to order its destruction." Cheers erupted. People clapped, some even whistled. The fear that had gripped this community for years cracked and shattered in an instant. Victoria pounded the gavel until her hand shook, but the noise no longer mattered. The authority she clung to had dissolved. Neighbors surged forward, not in chaos, but in unity. They pressed petitions back across the table, demanding answers. One woman raised her voice from the crowd. "You fined me for a swing set. Was that even legal?" Another shouted, "You threatened to tow my car without authority?" The questions poured in, heavy as rain. Victoria tried to answer, but the words collapsed under the weight of the evidence. For the first time, she looked small behind that table, her power stripped bare under the fluorescent glare. I turned toward the crowd, lifting my voice above the storm. This isn't about revenge, it's about taking back what belongs to us. Tonight, we stand as neighbors, not subjects, and we decide what happens next. Applause shook the walls. Marcus stepped closer, his hand brushing the petitions. The vote begins now. The gavel slipped from Victoria's hand, clattering against the table, and just like that, her reign ended. The vote was swift. Sheets passed from hand to hand, pens scratching as neighbors signed their names one last time. When the final tally was read aloud, the room erupted. Cheers, clapping, even tears. Victoria sat frozen, her gavel useless, as the board was officially dissolved. For years she had ruled by fear and silence. Tonight, silence had turned into voices, and fear had become fire. I stood at the front, watching the crowd transform. The same neighbors who once kept their heads down now stood tall, shoulders back, reclaiming what had been stolen from them. Marcus moved among them, no longer hunched with shame, but upright, answering questions, explaining procedures. His defection had sealed Victoria's fall, but more than that, it had shown others they could choose courage too. Claire slipped her arm through mine. "Dad would have been proud," she whispered. My throat tightened, but I managed a nod. Outside the hall's windows, the oak trees swayed in the night breeze, leaves rustling like applause. When the crowd finally thinned, I walked out beneath the streetlights. The petitions, the ordinances, the binder, they had done their job. But it was the people who carried the real weight tonight. For the first time, this neighborhood belonged to its homeowners again. The next morning, I returned to the oak. Sunlight poured through its branches, painting dappled patterns across the lawn. I rested my hand against the bark, feeling the steady pulse of life deep inside. It had survived storms, decades, and now the threat of a woman's ambition. My wife joined me, baby cradled against her shoulder. "It's safe now," she said softly. "Because of all of us," I replied. And it was true. The tree was no longer just my father's legacy. It had become the symbol of a community reclaiming its voice. Over the following weeks, we set to work rebuilding. Temporary committees were formed, neighbors volunteering to oversee finances, landscaping, security. For the first time, decisions weren't dictated from above. They were debated, discussed, decided together. The mood shifted tangibly. Smiles replaced scowls, porch lights stayed on longer, conversations bloomed in driveways. Victoria tried to stir resistance, whispering threats of lawsuits and appeals, but her words carried no weight anymore. Without the board behind her, she was just another homeowner, bound by the same rules as everyone else. And when her bluster fell flat, she grew quieter, retreating into the shadows of the very houses she once lorded over. Marcus, meanwhile, became something of a bridge. Some still looked at him with suspicion for his role in the old board, but he faced it openly, answering questions, taking responsibility, and putting his skills to work for the new system. Redemption doesn't come quickly, but step by step, he earned back trust. As for me, I didn't set out to lead a rebellion. I only wanted to protect a tree that held my father's memory. But in fighting for it, I'd uncovered something larger, that power only survives if people surrender it. And when ordinary people choose to stand, even the most entrenched authority can crumble. One evening, I gathered with neighbors beneath the oak. Folding chairs circled around its trunk, kids darting between roots, laughter filling the air. We weren't here for fines or lectures. We were here for community. Looking around, I realized this was the neighborhood my father had imagined when he planted the oak. Strong, rooted, and unafraid. I raised my voice, speaking to the circle, but also, in a way, to anyone beyond it who might hear. This isn't the end, it's the beginning. If we can take back our neighborhood, so can anyone facing the same fight. Don't let fear silence you. Stand tall, dig deep, and remember, roots are always stronger than rules. The crowd cheered, the oak's leaves shivering overhead like a banner in the wind. And if you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.